Jackie? I know it. I know it. I know it. Cindy Lou, good to see you. Good morning. Dante. Good morning, Don. Good to see you. Oh, man, I'm so glad to be back in class. Oh, Randy. Yeah. I just, I'm so thankful that PJ on short notice took over for me last Sunday. I thought for sure that I'd be able to preach and teach last week. But even though I knew this surgery is going to be really a brutal one, because the pastor already told me that, and warned me ahead of time, little did I know how brutal it was. And that combined with various mind-altering pain medication, which I quickly aborted from as soon as I could. I was in no place to teach class. Oh, my goodness. Oh, I know. I saw her on TV. And but I mean to tell you, my head felt like it was full of cotton. I mean, I just couldn't even think straight. And I was trying to talk to people. Anyhow, I'm doing much better today. Nurse Vera's taking good care of me. Right, babe? She's trying. But I tell you, I've been telling people that, in the past I've studied about various types of ways that people have been tortured, and it often involves the shoulders. And now I know why. It's very effective. Oh my goodness, it's just kind of crazy. So if you never have to have that done, take care of your shoulders and do physical therapy and do anything besides have surgery on your shoulders. That'll be great advice for you today. Trust me. So anyhow, so I'm very coherent and I'm ready to teach class. Raj, I'm very proud of my brother Roger. Came to the run yesterday, ran that 5K. Dude, you're amazing. So great job. So yeah, he's the man. Yes, you were. Yes. Well, I don't know by far. Let's see. Herb was probably next closest to you. So yeah, that was. Oh, you know what? That's right. She comes to every single one of my events. She's just an amazing lady. She's in her 80s, but she walks them. But yeah, she always comes.
It's funny. She started walking with her cane. Once she said go, that cane came up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's neat. Okay, so Romans 16. We've made it to Romans 16. And Romans 16, oftentimes I know there are people who will get to Romans 16 and think, oh, this is just a bunch of, goodbyes. It's just like looking at the end of a letter and just, really isn't much there. And they go over it too quickly. And oh my, you shouldn't go over that too quickly. Yes, he is saying some final goodbyes, but there's more to it as you read his goodbyes, because it tells us a lot about Paul, about the people that he's saying goodbye to, about various practices in the church, and helps us understand how to do church, or at least how they. Well, let me back it up. If our premise is to do church like they did in the first century, you'll learn a lot from Romans chapter 16. And that has always been my premise since becoming a Christian. It's a movement that began in the 18th century called Restoration Movement. And it has to basically restore the primitive church principles in doing church life. And it's not saying that they're perfect, because obviously they had huge problems. But in those huge problems, such as the letter to the church at Corinth, we can learn how we're supposed to do it. So, but there are definite principles on how to do church life in the New Testament. And so Romans 16 is very, very important. Hopefully you all remember to go through Romans 16, read all those tough, difficult names, especially some of those Roman and Greek names, right? They're kind of tough to pronounce. And I'll give you my pronunciation. And if it's not correct, I'll just fake it like it is. But anyhow, it's not so important that you pronounce them correctly as to learn a little bit about some of them. Some of them that we'll look at, this is the only time they're mentioned. And we don't know anything about them besides what we read here. But some of them we do have some good background on. By the way, those who have been with me in classes on, the pastoral letters, such as 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians, and we've looked at some of the passages regarding people's ideas about women's place in the church, as far as leadership and what they can and cannot do and things like that. May be very interested to know that Paul is not a woman hater, as some particular radical women's groups have made him out to be. And so the easiest way to deal with Paul from their account is, well, just whatever Paul wrote about women, just rip it out of the Bible and throw it away, because he hated women. That is so ludicrous as to be laughable. Paul is just the opposite. He is one who gave women a place, an opportunity to utilize their giftings that God had given them in a time and a place where they never before were allowed to. And women were a huge part of Paul's ministry, and we'll look at that today as well. And so this is the nicest way I can say it. Are those radical feminists who would destroy Paul's words are simply ignorant of what the text actually says. And they won't do the hard work to find out exactly what's going on in those, especially two particular texts, 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy chapter 2. They both have excellent answers, and in no way does Paul put women into this subcategory above males. And you'll definitely see that here in Romans 16, where we have him saying goodbyes to about 28 people, depending on how you count them. And out of those, 9 or possibly 10 are women. And I say 10 because it depends again how you count them. When it talks about Rufus and his mother, it doesn't mention her by name, but his mother is mentioned in there. So that's huge. That's huge. And especially as he puts them into their context. And he begins, Bruce, am I being recorded? Okay, thank you very much. He begins in chapter 16 with the most amount of text in this goodbye to who? Phoebe. To a lady named Phoebe, okay? So I want you to understand that my feeling in regards to many evangelical church groups, they do not give the press to Phoebe that I believe they should. Phoebe was quite the influential and vitally important servant in the early church. And we'll see this here in 16:1 and 2. I'll go ahead and read the text. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church in Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and to give her any help she may need from you. For she has been a great help to many people, including me. Now, this is one situation where the NIV capitulates again to the mainstream, don't upset the patriarchal order of the scriptures. And fortunately, years later, the NIV came out with the TNIV, which they corrected many of their errors, but then created some more with it, unfortunately. But they did correct some of this stuff here. And some of the newer translations, I just got a new Bible called the Passion. I love what they do in that Passion Bible here, because what they do is they get to the heart and the passion, and they bring out a lot of the original language in the footnotes, and so that you can see what's really going on in this text. So as is my custom, I'm going to look at a few of your translations, and I'll share some other things with you. And we're going to do a little bit of Greek study here. And even with my dear friend, Dr. Paul Pollard, and I was reading his commentary on this, I respectfully disagree with him in this regards to Romans 16. But I understand, he comes from a movement that is very heavily dominated in this doctrine, and it would be hard for him to go against the goads. I understand that. I respect him tremendously. I respect his scholarship, but not in this one here. I totally disagree with him. But anyhow, we'll look at that. So I like to start out with King James Version. I'm hoping Cheryl brought her King James. And if you would be so kind as to read 16, 1 and 2 for us nice and loud. Synchria, yeah. Which one? Do they got benefactor or patron? Oh, okay. Okay, good. Lori, how about the New Living Translation? I'm curious. I didn't even look at that this week. Huh? Okay, I love 2 out of the 3 points the NLT does. Did you notice what they called Phoebe there? A deacon. Okay. All right, so I've covered the NLT, the King James, and I'm missing one. Let's see, but I don't see anybody else. Anybody else have another translation? Okay, so some things going on. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. And that is the New Century Version. Okay, hear how they said it? That they translate helper, but then they have a footnote, deaconess. Okay, so we got some things to talk about here. Yeah, NIV uses servant. Some actually translate minister. Some, very few translate minister, by the way. Deacon, helper, servant. Okay, and it's really important as Paul is describing Phoebe. Number one, in this section where he's saying, giving goodbyes and really giving them a sense of honor in this letter, Phoebe is the lady who's carrying this letter. Do you realize that? Phoebe is the one, all scholars agree, that she is the one who's carrying this letter to Rome. Phoebe is. Okay? She is the first one mentioned here and gets the most press. That in itself should tell you something right off the bat about Phoebe. Paul's using this letter of commendation. This letter of commendation is very traditional. It's very common for the person who's carrying the letter. But the carrying of the letter of itself carries some importance. And the key thing here with Phoebe is in the wording that Paul is using here. And this is where some of the scholars will disagree, and they have a hard time calling Phoebe a deacon. How come? I know the Greek. I study the Greek. I have a minor degree in Greek. I know the grammar. I look at it. I know the arguments, okay? And I understand how people are trying to not make her an officer, if you will, in the church. And they would say things like, well, there is no church office of the diaconate at this point in time. Totally disagree. And we'll see that from Philippians chapter 1 and other passages as well. There was a developing office in the church of the deacon, okay? And so when we look at Romans 16, what Paul is saying here is, I'm giving this commendation to our dear sister Phoebe. And he describes her as a deacon. The word is very clear in the Greek. Diakonos. And it is neither, even though in gender it's male, it can be used for a male or a female. And it's used in different places in the Bible as male or female. And it can be used as simply a servant, a helper, and that kind of thing, depending on the context. But I don't want you to miss a point. There's another part of this sentence, the clause says, she is a this of the church of Cenchrea. That's a genitive. It's like, I'm trying to think of a good genitive. You are the trustee of Raisin Township. Okay, it shows positioning within the church. And so it's extremely, extremely important to understand what Paul is doing. He's making a description of Phoebe. He's commending her to the church in Rome and showing them where she belongs as a deacon of the church at Cenchrea, a very important and influential person within this congregation. And so I understand where people are saying if they're going to say, no, this is just going to be an adjective describing some of the work that she does there, that she's just a helper, and helpers are good, and they're, all of us are, in a sense, a diakonos in the right context, that we're all helpers, servants, volunteers, that kind of thing. But not when you're framing it the way that Paul is here in this grammar. Let me give you for instance. Flip over to Philippians. How you like that? Flip over to Philippians. Philippians chapter 1. Because I'm going to show you another grammar structure here. So Paul, as he's writing to a church in the city of Philippi, he begins by saying, to all the saints in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. I do not see how we can look at that any other than there are saints, there are Christians there. There are those who serve in the office of the elder and those who serve in the office of the deacon. Now, it's an office not in the sense of an elected office. It's an office in the sense of servantship, but it's servant leadership. And there was established at the time that Paul's writing Philippians, which is in, around 60, 62 AD. So there already is this developed position within the church called the deacon. And this is the same grammar structure that's used back here with Phoebe. And I pull my hair out and say, translators, why do you translate a deacon over here in Philippians chapter 1, but you refuse to do it with Phoebe here in chapter 16? I just totally disagree with that. But there have been a few that have done the proper translation and translating Phoebe as a deacon. The one that really bugs me is Vera's over there, because, and this is the way that many, I don't want to categorize them. Let's just put it some commentators will say, well, there was this developing office of deaconess. Okay? Well, when Paul wrote this, what was the Greek word for deaconess? Anybody here going to remember what I've taught before about this? What was the Greek word for deaconess in Paul's day? Huh? No. Good guess, though. Anybody? There was no such word. The word was invented in the 3rd century by the Catholic Church. Okay? And which eventually possibly was what developed into what we know as the nunnery. Okay? So in Paul's time, make no mistake about it, this is absolute fact, there was no word deaconess in his vocabulary. It didn't exist. It'd be like me and Roger, when we were in our teens, to say, hey, Raj, why don't you Google this topic? And he'd say, what in the world are you talking about? Okay, so words develop over time. And there's a reason for that. And usually these things come from misuse. Okay? And we'll talk about some of the misuses and what happened in the early development of the Catholic Church and how they came to develop this office of the deaconess of just simply women serving women and segregating the men and the women. Okay? But that wasn't Paul. And when he's talking about Phoebe here, he's not talking about a nunnery. He's not talking about just, this gal who's washing baby bottles and, working in the kitchen or working in the nursery or cooking meals or, doing all the behind scenes that, many guys are very happy to let the women do all that stuff while they sit and have their meals served to them, I'm kind of going to Kenya right now when I'm thinking this. And you think Kenya, you can think of what it was like back in Paul's day. Because that's how it was. Extremely patriarchal. And yet Paul is raising this Phoebe up as a deacon of the church at Cenchrea, an influential one. More than likely, she was a wealthy one. She was, and going down further, again, the NIV doesn't do a really good job with describing Phoebe as just being a person who's been a great help to many people. She was a patrosis, a patron, a benefactor, okay? Means she had money. And she used her money and influence to help Paul in his ministry and to help the church. And she was very influential and very much a leader in this early church. And Paul is making that clear. This is who is coming to you with this letter. And so you would do well to welcome her because she has been a great help to many people, including me. But receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints and give her any help she may need from you. So Phoebe is an extremely important person in the church at Cenchrea, but an important servant, a servant leader. And I just don't think she gets the press that she deserves and doesn't get translated properly. She should simply be called a deacon. And then, of course, the NIV here, the one I have, the 1984 edition, also has a footnote, or deaconess. No. It just really irritates me when they put deaconess. And because there is no such word in Paul's vernacular as a deaconess. There is only the Greek word for deacon. Period. That's it. Diakonos. That's the word. One word for all people in this particular office and role of serving. Okay? And so, Philippians chapter 4, again, looking at the Apostle Paul, looking at how he felt about and worked with women in the early church. Philippians chapter 4, Paul's finishing off with some wonderful words to the church there about unity. Well, there was a problem with unity in the church at Philippi with two ladies, Euodia and Syntyche, in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 2. And Paul says, it's almost a prayer. I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Okay. And then he goes on and he asks his friends to help these women since they have contended for the gospel alongside my fellow co-workers, Clement and my other co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Now look at what's going on here. This Euodia and Syntyche, that they weren't seeing things the same in the Lord. If they were not, in fact, a vital part of the leadership, it wouldn't have been such a big deal, and I don't believe Paul would have called it out publicly. But they were. They were an important part of the church of Philippi. By the way, I'll task your knowledge here. In the book of Acts, how did Paul get the church at Philippi started? Who was the first convert to the church in Philippi? Lydia. Okay? And so through Lydia and her household, the church was begun. And so no doubt there were many influential women who did preaching and teaching and evangelization in the church at Philippi. And these women, whenever they came on board and became Christians, were a part of that. And to have any kind of disagreement in that first level of that phrase, in matters of doctrine, unity, Paul's dealing with Euodia and Syntyche. And so, again, but just his relationship to them, that they contended at my side in the cause of the gospel. These two ladies. And so, to just relegate women to just other jobs that don't involve the preaching and teaching of the gospel is just foreign to the Apostle Paul. Just totally foreign. He never prohibited women from utilizing the giftings that they had. He did champion unity. So the problem in 1 Timothy was unity. And some women there who were disrupting unity. He had said the same thing to men had they been disrupting unity and been overbearing on the rest of the congregation. So anyhow, there's Our Lady Phoebe. Give her the credit that she has coming to her. And then Paul goes right into Priscilla and Aquila in verse 3. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. And also greet the church that meets at their house. Priscilla and Aquila. Oh, man. These guys were very special to Paul. You can go back and read the book of Acts, and you can read specifically in Acts chapter 18. And so Priscilla and Aquila were a husband and wife team. They were also tent makers, along with Paul. They had Paul living with them for a certain amount of time, and Paul led them to Jesus. And 6 out of the 8 times Priscilla is mentioned, she's always mentioned first. Priscilla and Aquila. Now, let's just think about that from a common sense point of view. We all know couples, right? And we know in some couple relationships where the husband is more dominant, we usually say his name first. But in a situation where the woman's more dominant, we usually say her name first. Usually. It's a general rule. And so this is what's happening here. By Paul mentioning Priscilla more often than Aquila first, one can easily assume that Priscilla was a teacher of the word, an influential person in the early work of the church, which is preaching and teaching. And so they, in Acts chapter 18, they had met up with another guy by the name of Apollos. You guys remember Apollos? Okay? So, how do you know Apollos? What do you remember him from? Do you guys remember? Remember, he was the one who was a very eloquent speaker. Not Apollos, but anyhow, the big thing with Apollos was that he was preaching the baptism of John. Yeah. And so they had to take him aside, teach him more perfectly the way. So what they did was, and this is a good practice, is that instead of, making him feel bad publicly, they brought him home to dinner and then taught him more perfectly the way. So the baptism of Jesus, as opposed to just the baptism of John. And so, anyhow, Priscilla no doubt led that discussion with Apollos, who many people think that he wrote the book of Hebrews. Not Paul. We all know not Paul, right? We studied Hebrews. Definitely not Paul. There's no Paul style in all of Hebrews. But I also leave room to say that maybe, in fact, it was Priscilla who wrote the book of Hebrews. That's very radical. And it may be the very reason her name is left off of the letter to the Hebrews, so as not to affect its influence. Because you guys know the tradition and the culture of the time that you could have 6 women standing on a street corner, and you had a camel accident, and you had one guy across the street. They wouldn't ask the 6 women. They don't ask the one man. They were not worthy witnesses. So as you write a letter such as the letter to the Hebrews, a general epistle for the church, it's a witness. Okay? And so maybe it was Priscilla, who was a teacher of Apollos, Christian speaking, Christian doctrine. Maybe she wrote Hebrews. Think about that. That's radical. But it's not out of the realm of possibility. Very possible. And so here's another gal who was very influential. They had a house church. Back in their time, they didn't have church buildings. They had house churches. And so that's why Paul says, not only greet Priscilla and Aquila, but also greet the church that meet at their house. So however many Christians met at their house. Which is interesting. As you look at through Romans 16 here, you're going to see several greetings to different house churches, 3 or 4 at least, but there was probably dozens of house churches at the Church of Rome. What's really amazing is that this church in Rome was established even before Paul became an apostle. And so he talks about those who were in Christ before him, who were up in Rome. And so this is how the early church worked. They had house churches, but they also found places where collectively they could all come together on Sunday. And does anybody have any remembrance of where I've shared in Rome where they met as a collective body, especially, for instance, after the Jews had been kicked out of Rome after the fire in 70 A.D.? Where did Christians have a tendency to meet? Huh? Catacombs, exactly. Catacombs. And so they could do it secretly. And as a matter of fact, one time, Romans found where they were meeting in these catacombs, and they closed both entrances and buried them in there alive. So, man, I tell you what, there's a whole sermon in that when people think about the privilege and joy of coming collectively together to worship God, when you might lose your life for doing that. But they did it anyhow. But anyhow, house church was the practice of, of, if you will, almost like congregations, local congregations throughout the Church of Rome. But they all, on Sunday, all came together collectively for a time of praise and worship. And wherever they could congregate together, they would do it. So that's Priscilla and Aquila. Wonderful. You can learn more about her in the book of Acts. And but she's another fellow worker. She's a fellow worker. Greet Priscilla, my fellow worker. And you got to just think, what did Paul do? Well, Priscilla was a fellow worker. All right? So, very important. And then goes on in verse 5, greet my dear friend Epaenetus, who was the first convert to Christ in the province of Asia, and greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. And so, we got these first 5 verses, and each one is a lady that's mentioned in here. And do you really believe that Paul's a woman hater? I mean, really? Come on. Obviously not. The women were very, very important in his ministry and in the ministry of the church as a whole. And so we don't want to handcuff anybody in the church from working. But Epaenetus was the first person to be baptized in the province of Asia. That this is all we know about this person. That they have that, that status. And then, of course, Mary, who is a hard-working lady. Another hard-working lady. And again, try to imagine. First century church. You're meeting in homes. You're gathering collectively together the catacombs. What did she work hard at? What did she work hard at? What was her hard work? Don't be bashful. Okay. Let me ask a question about that, because that's the first thing we seem to go to is, the cooking the food. Didn't she cook food every day? Why does he commend all the other people that are cooking their dinners too? You follow what I'm saying? I mean, we cook food. Would Paul necessarily commend her in a special place here as a hard worker just simply because she's doing what we do every day anyhow? Cooking food? Huh? Cleaning up the catacombs? PJ?
This is all about the work of Jesus.
This is Romans, baby. And if you can put one word on Romans, this is gospel. It's about people coming to salvation through Christ. Her hard work was in teaching and sharing the gospel. That's the hard work that Paul's talking about. That's the kind of hard work that deserves commendation, recognition. Sweeping the catacombs. On that, I finish. I'm going to go throw myself in front of a bus. I'm sorry, the your? What are you talking about? She's to the audience in Rome.
The Romans, right?
Yeah.
That's what I thought. I was just making sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In the way the NIV would say is greet Mary who worked very hard for you.
For you in Rome.
Yeah. Who are now Christians. Who are now saved. Who are now going to heaven. Because of what Mary did. Think about it. All right. I'm done. I went 2 minutes over. Please forgive me.